Everyone in South Africa, I think, can appreciate that if we don't keep the current coal plants running and bring them under adult supervision in a new portfolio to be managed by somebody other than the South African government today and also the Eskom team that's basically looting and pillaging, the lights will go out in South Africa. We've gotten thousands of questions about security of supply for electricity in South Africa. And the short answer is we cannot guarantee that the system will hold up much longer. The reality is it's in very, very, very bad shape, as we've talked about many times. And the poorest of the poor in South Africa are suffering the worst. But this all goes back to poor leadership, fraud, corruption, embezzlement. The current government, the ruling party, and the criminal cartels who they patronize and show patronage to, have stolen everything in South Africa. And I cannot guarantee you today or next week that Eskom's power plants won't completely collapse and the grid will go dark. But rest assured, adult supervision is involved, working extremely diligently to try to come up with a resolution that will guarantee security of supply for South Africa's energy for the South African citizens, not for the ruling party, not for the criminal cartel.
Good day and welcome to this podcast on Friday 13th of January 2023. I just played the sound clip extracted from a video by an American, Carl Miller, that recently surfaced on social media. The video that went viral was titled "South Africa is on the verge of complete collapse" and attracted over 42,000 views on YouTube. In this sensational video, Mr. Miller makes an ominous prediction of Eskom's impending doom. According to Miller, due to Eskom's stranded cost, future unavoidable expenses, and liabilities, the utility will require a cash injection of 2.3 trillion rands to be fixed. Carl Miller suggests that these problems are merely the symptom of a much larger problem, that problem being ANC corruption and the many criminal syndicates profiting off the utility. So what's new about a corrupt ANC? What new is there that Mr. Miller can teach the South African people? Mr. Miller wasted little time telling South Africans that he could fix Eskom on their behalf. In his words, "If we don't keep the current coal plants running and bring them under adult supervision in a new portfolio to be managed by somebody other than the South African government or the current corrupt Eskom team, the lights will go out in South Africa." Even more disturbing were his remarks toward the end of the video. He told South Africans that they could rest assured because adult supervision is already busy working on a plan to guarantee a secure electricity supply for the South African poor. Now, when exactly did South Africans give others the right to intervene on their behalf? While Miller does not state who these so-called adults in the room are, it is self-evident who he is referring to. From experience, one knows that these adults care little for the people of South Africa. They only do what is good for themselves. We saw that during the recent pandemic. They use the Hegelian dialectic, where they create the problem. They then wait for a reaction before they come up with a solution. A solution from which they are the only ones to profit. Yes, South Africans want to see the end of ANC corruption and incompetence. However, they are not willing to exchange one form of tyranny for another. I decided to make this podcast as I felt the urgent need to warn South Africans against charlatans like Miller. I want to be clear. I am not an energy expert, but I know bullshit when I see it. Miller's plan is not about fixing Eskom. It is about the great Eskom heist. I urge every South African to wake up and oppose what is happening in your country. I guarantee you that in time you will regret your indifference if you don't stand up now. Mr. Miller and the people he represents have deceived South Africans for decades about their real motives for the country. Miller is just one cog in a more sophisticated criminal network that is currently busy pillaging Eskom and every other state-owned enterprise in South Africa. In this podcast, I want to expose this criminal syndicate and help South Africans understand what is currently happening at Eskom and why the country is experiencing stage 6 load shedding. The current events at the utility pose the single greatest threat to the country, and no one seems to be discussing this danger. Everyone I listen to is in lockstep with the official narrative. Through this podcast, I hope to steer the discourse in a different direction and unveil the dark counter-narrative. Once this veil of deception lifts, the South African people can hopefully make more informed decisions. During this podcast, you will learn that the current dysfunctional Eskom and the resurgence of load shedding since 2018 are all part of a cleverly devised scam to privatize Eskom and put it into the hands of international bankers. But I am getting ahead of myself. Now, for this heist to succeed, they must overcome two hurdles. Firstly, they must convince Eskom's creditors, such as the International Monetary Fund and investment banks, that the power utility is no longer a true going concern. Mr. Miller's team argues that Eskom, under its current legal, operational, and governance structure, has devolved into an operationally dysfunctional, financially insolvent, unreliable, and corrupt entity. They also try to convince creditors that Eskom's baseload generation fleet, transmission, and distribution systems are damaged beyond repair. Secondly, they must manufacture the consent of the South African people. They can only obtain such consent through a persistent campaign of subversion. Subversion starts with demoralization, then destabilization, and then the crisis. Once groomed, the people will quickly give up any of their rights in the misguided belief that these actions are, in fact, normalizing the situation. We saw during the last pandemic how easily people gave up inalienable rights, such as the right to bodily integrity and informed consent. The mainstream media is used to ramp up fear to help keep the public in a permanent vegetative state in which their reality becomes perversely altered. The former KGB agent Yuri Bezmenov defines subversion as a destructive, aggressive activity aimed at destroying the country, or the nation of your enemy, by demoralizing the cultural values and changing the population's perception of reality. From 2018 onwards, they would embark on a ruthless campaign of rolling blackouts by quietly removing 20,000 megawatts from the national power grid.
Mineral Resources and Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe insists South Africa has enough electricity. He's sticking to his guns that 20,000 megawatts of electricity are sitting idle at Eskom. He was speaking at an energy and mining investment conference in Limpopo today. ENCA reporter Moloko Moloto has the story.
Gwede Mantashe says renewable energy won't end power cuts, and it would be reckless to do away with coal energy.
But what we need to pay our attention to today is that Eskom has 48,000 megawatts connected. At best, it gives us 26,000 megawatts. So there's an idle 20,000 megawatts that are not decommissioned, that are idle, that are not giving us any energy. And we must focus on that in the meantime to resolve the issue of load shedding.
And that is available, but idle.
But why is it not being rolled out to the people?
Now it requires management of Eskom. As I said, it is a function of leadership, it's a function of skills, it's a function of appreciating priorities, but not of maintaining and servicing those units.
These rolling blackouts are meant to accelerate the collapse of the power utility and finally bring the country to its knees. At this point, they hope South Africans will be so desperate that they will gladly relinquish their sovereignty and acquiesce to the dictates of the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, and his international collaborators. Once the IMF and the people are convinced that Eskom cannot be turned around, the utility will be moved into an asset recovery vehicle and unbundled. South Africans, they are lying to you. No one is telling you the truth about Eskom. I have listened to every energy expert and every social media commentator. They are all keeping you in the dark. This podcast will tell you the unadulterated truth about the Eskom crisis and load shedding. However, I must warn you. Some of you may experience cognitive dissonance. The information I will share can be overwhelming. but I urge that you stay with me. I only ask for your patience and an open mind. Because this topic is so vast, there is only so much I can talk about in this one podcast. I already feel that this talk is going to be too long. I therefore intend to make several more. I will attempt to lift this veil of deception in this first podcast by exposing this dark counter-narrative. Later podcasts will shed more light on the details of this diabolical plan. A few weeks ago, the country was shocked by the news that Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter had resigned. De Ruyter was stepping down as he no longer regarded his position as tenable. His resignation came in response to the Minister of Mineral Resource and Energy's comments, in which Mantashe accuses de Ruyter of sabotage and of agitating for the overthrow of the state. Mainstream media would further fuel the fire by blaming Pravin Gordhan and President Ramaphosa for not defending de Ruyter. The sky is falling narrative also continued as expected. Independent Online wrote, Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter was left in the dark, resignation massive blow for ending load shedding. Also, fears of worse load shedding rise. Until the end, the media would push the narrative that de Ruyter was the victim and that things would only worsen without him. There is little doubt that de Ruyter was key to the Eskom agenda. However, a few things changed in the last month that would accelerate de Ruyter's departure from Eskom. I want us to return to Andre de Ruyter's news conference on 15th of December. During this conference, de Ruyter let slip two critical pieces of information. I don't know if it was deliberate, but somehow the mainstream media failed to pick up on these two nuanced pieces of information. The first was an admission by de Ruyter that he was stepping back to make way for someone who was better suited or better equipped for the strategic objectives at hand. Secondly, he had hoped that through his resignation, Eskom could resume its crucial role of supplying South Africa with electricity. The strategic objective is to enable South Africa's growth as the country transitions to a more liberalized energy market. De Ruyter's admission that he could never focus on supplying the country with electricity is no surprise. His failure to turn the power utility around is proof enough of that. He became so obsessed with reducing the Eskom debt that funding would be channeled away from other crucial operational priorities, such as maintenance. However, the reasons given by de Ruyter for stepping down confirm that the utility is being steered down an entirely new strategic path. De Ruyter seems convinced that his replacement will be better equipped to operate Eskom within a liberalized energy market. In this case, the word liberal is synonymous with free market or competitive. In other words, Eskom will cease to operate as a non-profit public utility that provides electricity as a social good to the South African people. De Ruyter's resignation confirms that the neoliberal agenda for Eskom has moved into its next phase. One could not help but notice some odd behavior patterns concerning de Ruyter. Unlike his predecessors, he constantly looked to blame everyone else but himself for what went wrong at Eskom. If de Ruyter did not blame saboteurs, he would blame the Eskom board. If it were not the board, it would be the fault of the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigations, the Hawks, who were conspicuously absent in probing acts of sabotage. If it was not the fault of the Hawks, then it was the fault of his predecessors who drove the plants too hard. What further sets him apart from his predecessors is that a book titled Sabotage, Eskom Under Siege was expressly commissioned to help portray him as a victim. On the back cover, News 24 investigative journalist Kyle Cowan writes, "From forensic investigations and botched probes to accusations of racism, de Ruyter and Oberholzer have spent significant amounts of time fending off allegation after allegation. Amid this onslaught, it has become clear that their enemies will take any measure necessary to have them removed from office." Again, just how many false allegations did Brian Molefe and Motshelo Coco have to fend off? However, the book served a much greater purpose than just allaying de Ruyter's paranoid delusions. The book's goal was to weave a media narrative that ANC malfeasance and incompetence have turned Eskom into a national disaster. On page 195, Cowan concludes, It has only been under the leadership of Ruyter that, finally, a real effort is being made to return power stations to a state of reliability and to re-inject an ethos of accountability and purpose into the utility. It is these strides that remain our greatest hope of achieving energy security and ending load shedding. Thus, if Eskom and the country are ever to move forward, the onslaught against Ruyter and Oberholzer must end. Is Kyle Cowan serious? What state of reliability? What ethos of accountability? And what hope has he given the people for energy security and an end to load shedding? One needs no further proof that Cowan is Ruyter's paid publicist appointed to create a fictional storyline around a man that has been out of his depth since the word go. Cowan constructs a storyline that much of Eskom's troubles are driven by unknown enemies of Ruyter and COO, Jan Oberholzer. Stories of conspiracies and subterfuge drive the sabotage narrative. This narrative is what brings Eskom and the country into a crisis. The crisis is of such a magnitude that it calls for a tenacious response. And this is where saviors such as Carl Miller enter the fray with the solution that calls for the declaration of a state of emergency in South Africa's energy sector. The book's sensationalist storylines drive the narrative that unknown saboteurs toppled a strategic pylon near Letabo Power Station in the Free State in November 2021. This act had, almost, caused the whole country to plunge into Stage 6 load shedding. Let me repeat. Almost, but not yet. The hero, Ruyter, emerges from the shadows to declare war against this invisible enemy when he exclaims that this is clearly an act of sabotage. I think we can call it such. Now it is important to understand that acts of sabotage, theft and fraud are costly for the power utility. News 24 wants to construct the narrative that incidents of sabotage at Eskom power stations thwart efforts to halt load shedding. However, Cowan's book fails to prove that sabotage, theft or fraud is in fact the cause. Why can't he show a connection? Because Eskom's own informational brochure says there is no link. According to Eskom, there are 6 primary reasons for load shedding, none of which speaks to those issues listed. Why did the media start pushing the sabotage, criminal syndicate and fraud narratives? Why did such a spike in coal mafia activity targeting Eskom by business tech and the big coal switch by carte blanche suddenly start flooding the news feed? Because this plays into the CRO advisor's narrative that Eskom has devolved into an operationally dysfunctional, financially insolvent, unreliable, and corrupt entity. In September 2022, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime published a report titled Strategic Organized Crime Risk Assessment for South Africa. This report identifies 3 major criminal problems at Eskom, namely cable theft, illegal connections, and meter tampering. No mention is made of coal, truck, fuel, maintenance syndicates or even sabotage in the report. Why do you think that may be the case? I can think of 2 reasons. Firstly, who is running these criminal syndicates? Black or white people? Look at the carte blanche clip again. The second reason is that until now, reporting on these crimes did not fit the narrative. Now it does. However, the South African public will not study these types of reports. They've got better things to do, right? Sadly, the propaganda of print media and sensation-seeking actuality programs such as Carte Blanche mainly shapes the worldview of the South African people. Their imagination is easily captured by stories of a spectre cutting electricity pylons with heavy-duty equipment for no apparent reason. They will applaud the heroism of a man who has declared war on a phantom enemy and for standing up to the thugs who spy on him with sophisticated car tracking equipment. I don't blame the South African public. The war for your minds is real. People are bombarded with fake news and disinformation. Who can really make sense of the Eskom situation? Excuse the pun. But we are all in the dark when it comes to Eskom. The National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, being close to the situation on the ground, was quick to see through the bullshit. NUMSA believes that key figures in Eskom's destruction are Ruyter and Gordon. According to the NUMSA website, These two have survived the chop because the dominant narrative in the media is to defend the Eskom management even though their incompetence is so glaringly obvious. NUMSA believes that Andre de Ruyter's qualifications and work experience have not prepared him at all for the role of Eskom CEO, and he keeps demonstrating his inability with every new stage of load shedding that is announced. NUMSA observes that there has never been a CEO who has failed as spectacularly as de Ruyter, in the short time that he has been leading Eskom. When de Ruyter started at Eskom, he promised the nation that he would end load shedding within 18 months. 2 years later, he has failed to uphold that promise. Eskom's energy availability is the lowest it has ever been in the history of the organization's existence. As a result, the country's economy is in intensive care, and yet, bizarrely, when NUMSA and other organizations call for his dismissal, some in the media, particularly so-called energy experts, passionately defend him. The energy availability factor stood at 67% just before de Ruyter arrived at Eskom. At the time of his resignation, it plummeted to a new low of 51%. According to the medium-term system adequacy outlook, the EAF must remain above 67% for the Reliability Maintenance Recovery Program to arrest the decline in plant performance. For de Ruyter's entire tenure, Eskom operated below these critical levels, never being able to reverse the decline. On the contrary, Brian Molefe and Motshelo Coco had very little problem improving plant performance. Between 2015 and 2018 the EAF increased from 71 to 78%. However, as soon as Cyril Ramaphosa became president in February 2018, the fortunes of Eskom changed. Why this sudden turnaround? Was de Ruyter's failure the result of incompetence, or was it by design? What do we need to know about Andre de Ruyter's appointment? Why was he appointed in the first place? What was his real mandate? Was fixing Eskom and ending load shedding ever part of his KPIs? The short answer is that de Ruyter was appointed with the express purpose of dismantling the power utility. Yes, that is true. Let me explain. According to the Eskom Integrated Report of March 2021, the utility's immediate priority is to address its financial and operational challenges to help stabilize the business, create a sound platform to leverage capabilities, and pursue a growth trajectory that supports national strategic imperatives and the just energy transition. This simply means rationalize Eskom to increase financial and operational efficiency, and pursue the objective of net zero by transitioning the utility's generation towards renewable energy. In other words, the task of the CEO is to dismantle Eskom by decommissioning all coal-fired power plants and unbundling the utility according to a fixed timeline.
The situation, I think, is very dire, and rightly it's been called so by the Eskom management. But we've now had stories for over 2.5 years from Eskom blaming this power station, blaming that power station, blaming this. But if you go back and you sit back a little bit and you look at what they've been saying for the last nearly 3 years, it's the same old story, same old, same old. And any competent management team would say, hey guys, why are we repeating the same mistakes? Why are we having the same incidents time and time again? I can guarantee you there are power stations very, very similar, if not identical to South Africa's coal fleet, that are operating perfectly all over the world. In fact, in Europe, they are busy opening up old power stations that are much older than Eskom's power stations, and they will also be operating perfectly. So the problem to me seems to be management and political interference. You can't keep on blaming the workers or the engines for breakdowns and the fallovers. There's got to be something bigger. You got to stand back and say, what is the bigger picture? And the bigger picture is that, and it's confirmed by Eskom's crowdsourcing for skills now and cry for help from all sorts of quarters. But the fact of the matter is that there's been mismanagement at Eskom at a gross level, and the current competency has got to be questioned. You cannot have new management in place for 3 years and you still have the same problems which they promised themselves to have sorted out within 18 months. So I've lost total confidence in the current management team at Eskom, as well as the political leadership, because it's clear that there's been a lot of political interference, especially as far as the mix of the fleet is concerned, allocation of funds, cutting off budgets of maintenance, etc., etc. It's a total disaster, and South Africans, it's time where they need to wake up and hold Eskom and the political leadership to account.
But Ted, so it sounds like you'd be part of the cohort that is calling for Andre de Ruyter to step down as Eskom CEO. The problem, though, is that other analysts that we've spoken to throughout the morning say that changing the management won't necessarily improve the situation at Eskom. So calling for his head is probably not ideal at the moment.
I had my reservations from day one. In fact, before day one, because he started earlier than what was supposed to start. So the fact of the matter is, you cannot expect people who have steered us into this precipice, or over the precipice, into this cavern of darkness, to be the same people to fix it up. If they knew better, then you must accuse them and charge them with treason and mismanagement. The fact of the matter is, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that they didn't know better, and that's why they messed the system up. So that's why I'm calling for new blood.
Interestingly enough, the job of dismantling Eskom was never initially earmarked for de Ruyter. No. They wanted a black man to be the fall guy. The man initially appointed for this controversial task was a former investment banker Phakamani Hottoby. Ramaphosa wasted very little time in removing all obstacles in the way of their plan. While still deputy president, Ramaphosa, in January 2018, would personally dismiss the acting Eskom CEO, Motshela Coco, so they could make way for Hottoby. Mr. Coco, a very competent 30-year veteran under the state capture cloud, was fired by Ramaphosa before leaving for Davos, where they would receive instructions on how to move forward with Eskom. Coco was given a 24-hour ultimatum on 25 January to resign or be fired. The embattled CEO took the matter to the labor court, and Eskom was blocked from terminating his contract. Judge Graham Moshaana ruled that Eskom's attempt to fire Coco, based on a directive from then-Deputy President Ramaphosa, was unlawful. However, Coco decided not to return to work following the judgment in his favor as he had moved on. Hottoby arrived at Eskom from Barclays Africa, where he was CEO for investment banking and speculative investing at this British imperial institution. He was the first career banker to be appointed as Eskom's CEO. Hottoby was appointed to the job because of his experience overseeing state-owned enterprises while working at the National Treasury under Finance Minister Trevor Manuel. The latter is loyal to the City of London and enjoys quarterly meetings with David de Rothschild. Manuel would work directly under the CEO of NM Rothschild and Sons in South Africa, Martin Kingston, as associate chairman. Hottoby was appointed with the primary mandate of stabilizing Eskom's finances. On 20th February, just days after Ramaphosa became president, Kingston wrote to Hottoby, instructing him to urgently conduct an independent assessment of Eskom's financial position. NUMSA had stumbled across this letter and discovered that the letter's content was to advise Eskom CEO on how the Rothschild should be appointed to advise and consult on how privatizing Eskom could be achieved. In essence, the Rothschild were writing a specification on how they should be appointed, in a clandestine fashion, in order to privatize Eskom. While Hottoby would initially deny any links with Rothschild, the then Energy Minister Jeff Radebe told Parliament that Hottoby had received a letter from Kingston. Radebe said, the power utility was already developing its own strategic plans, and Rothschild offered assistance in its long-term strategic planning. Radebe is obviously attempting to downplay the seriousness of the Rothschild advance before the Parliament, but it was ultimately this letter that would lead to the appointment of K.W. Miller's company, CRO Advisors, to oversee the Great Eskom Heist. The current destruction sowed by load shedding in the lives of individuals, families, schools, universities, clinics, and the broader South African economy can be traced back to this letter. There can be little doubt that the instructions in the Rothschild letter laid the foundation for the current Eskom crisis. The government's roadmap for Eskom adopted the process outlined in the CRO report, and this process has brought South Africa to this critical juncture in its history. But let us move on. We still have important ground to cover. Now, to everyone's surprise, Hottoby announced his resignation not even 5 months into the job. While citing health reasons through the unimaginable demands of the job. There was more to this. Those who appointed him were apparently unhappy with how he proceeded to stabilize the Eskom finances. His actions led to no retrenchments as hoped. Instead, employees received a 7.5% pay rise. They needed someone that was not afraid to cull the workforce and dismantle the organization. Hadebe was clearly not their man. Their salvation came through Andre de Ruyter, who managed his previous employer Nampak into near collapse. When de Ruyter arrived at Nampak in 2014, the company's market value stood at 29 billion. When he left, its market value was a measly 5 billion, a spectacular 84% drop. During the same time, the share price dropped from 40 rands and 92 cents to 7 rands and 35 cents, by 82%. While many had come out to defend de Ruyter, citing that much of the problems had existed before he arrived, he appeared to be the right man for the Eskom job because of the skill set he was bringing to the utility. Firstly, he had no difficulties retrenching staff. While at Nampak, he retrenched more than half of the workforce. The second skill he brought to Eskom was his experience with restructuring and turnaround mandates. As someone once said, de Ruyter is very good at running things down. During his 3 years at Eskom, de Ruyter would not disappoint.
An immediate to medium-term solution so that South Africans and the economy at large, Ted, can be brought out of these stage 6 blackouts, which could probably get worse?
Well, the fact of the matter is that if we stuck to what we said we were going to do, and that is to fix up the old plant and get the OEMs in and get rid of the pirate parts, 3 years ago when Mr. de Ruyter took office, that was his pledge. He then deviated from that pledge, and in fact, he went further. He cut the maintenance budgets, and so enabling himself to boast about early repayment of Eskom's loans of over 83 billion or 82 billion, if my memory serves me correctly. So the fact of the matter is, I don't care what the current narrative of Eskom is. It's a pack of lies. There's been deliberate mismanagement towards a different agenda to force South Africa and the Eskom into renewables, and it's very clear that even with 100 gigawatts of renewables, you cannot sort out the peak problems of missing baseload. Not in South Africa, which is a primary energy or primary activity type of country with mining and smelting and heavy industry. And there's no renewable energy without storage in the world that can sort out that peak time problem with that technology. You need to stick to what works, and that's where Eskom has deviated from the path. They've neglected the old fleet. They've deliberately cut back on maintenance. They've deliberately changed the skill sets of their organization to get rid of people that are skilled, etc., etc.
Let me quickly backtrack for a second. I started my research for this podcast the week before Christmas. It was set for release last Friday. However, a few unfortunate delays last week prevented me from releasing it as planned. Since then, the news of de Ruyter's failed assassination attempt broke, forcing me to retrace all my research up to that point. This is where I stumbled on some additional information that helped me understand why the Eskom agenda is moving forward at speed. I have to be honest. De Ruyter's sudden resignation took me a bit by surprise. It was my firm belief that they were not entirely done with him. But I'm digressing. On Christmas Day last year, News 24 published an article titled "Eskom Warns of 20 billion rand loss this year, as auditor finds fraud, with tender docks set on fire." It was this article that brought everything into perspective. Firstly, News 24 reported that Eskom had posted a fifth straight loss and warned the gap might widen, while its auditor cautioned that the entity might not be able to continue as a going concern. This announcement echoed the warning of Mr. Miller. Business Tech of 23 December 2022 cited that the major drain on Eskom was the debt burden. While there was a significant debt reduction, the debt owed by the utility fell only by 1% over the last financial year. A major contributing factor here was the significant drop in sales revenue. Eskom instituted load shedding for a record 197 days last year, and as a result, the utility did not generate enough revenue to cover its operating costs and interest bill despite some significant bailouts from the Treasury. There is very little hope of Eskom recovering despite NERSA approving an 18.65% tariff increase for the next financial year. Secondly, Deloitte and Touche, Eskom's auditor, expressed concern that the company may not be able to continue operating and said it had identified irregular expenditure, fruitless and wasteful costs, and losses due to criminal conduct. Implicated in such criminal conduct is Ruyter himself. The CEO was investigated for alleged procurement irregularities just before his resignation. According to the Sunday Times, this investigation involves the appointment of Stephen Myers, later named the COO of Eskom Ruyter Industries, a subsidiary of Eskom. The allegations are that Ruyter held initial discussions with a headhunting firm and negotiated a price for its services without following Eskom's procurement policies or the Public Finance Management Act. The position that Myers was appointed to was allegedly only created 3 months after Ruyter initiated his discussions with Woodburn Man. The Eskom board does not seem happy with the situation, which might have prompted Ruyter to resign. With Ruyter resigning, there is now greater urgency to place Eskom under the control of a new hands-on senior energy chief restructuring officer and a new independent senior energy executive management team. Thirdly, the auditor's report further found evidence of failure by the utility to comply with the Public Finance Management Act, Eskom said in a stock exchange filing. It also picked up other irregularities, including the purposeful destruction of tender documents in a fire, the possible falsification of documents, and a failure to investigate and report financial misconduct and irregularities. According to the filing, Deloitte had found that there was a material uncertainty relating to Eskom's ability to continue as a going concern. Due to the projected fall in the EAF, looking ahead at the 2023 financial year, Eskom said it again anticipates a loss of 20 billion rand. Such a projection would further be a cause of concern amongst its creditors. In this regard, CRO Advisors has already requested all creditors to send their confidential statements of holdings and willingness to support the ARV. According to CRO Advisors, gaining creditors' consent is the first step required to begin the restructuring of Eskom, which is financially and operationally insolvent. Finally, the auditor's report found evidence of failure by the utility to take action to correct breaches of the National Environmental Management Act. Eskom has failed to comply with particular provisions of the National Environmental Management Act, the Air Quality Act 2004 regarding emission standards for its various power plants. While extensions to these timelines were requested, some applications have already been declined. Applications at Duva, Letabo, Matimba, Matla, and Medupi were rejected. When implemented, the decision will result in the loss of baseload generation capacity, significantly impacting Eskom's mandate to supply stable and reliable electricity for the country's needs. While this may not be the deal breaker, this still presents a challenge to any CEO since it is now virtually impossible to return Eskom to the critical EAF levels as recommended in terms of the MTSAO. This further retards Eskom's financial recovery, which makes it inevitable that Eskom will be moved into the ARV. Mr. Miller, in a recent video, has already confirmed this.
Okay, just a quick update on South Africa and Eskom. Essentially, the accounting firms, and Deloitte too specifically, has had no choice but to come clean and declare Eskom essentially bankrupt. But at this point in time, we're moving very quickly, as aggressively as possible, to take the Eskom power plants, put them into an asset recovery vehicle where they can be ring-fenced, 100% protected from the criminal syndicates, and also to ensure that the South African government cannot have their hands on them. The emergency room is taking these power plants, bringing them under independent chief risk management and CRO essentially control with a world-class operating team, financial team, and then basically cutting out all the fraud and the corruption, and then rebuilding the best we can with what we have.
By now, it should be self-evident that Ruyter is not leaving Eskom because Mantashe hurt his feelings, and the workplace became untenable because of others. I believe that Ruyter's handlers believe they can no longer protect him while he has also outlived his usefulness. Eskom is about to be declared a bankrupt entity and will formally be moved into the ARV for the benefit of its creditors. Under the ARV, the Eskom creditors would own a majority stake in the new structure via debt-for-equity swap and establish an employee stock ownership program, an ESOP. The ARV will take control of all power plant operations, fuel procurement, and maintenance requirements and provide electricity to Eskom under long-term contracts to be negotiated. Once Eskom creditors agree to the ARV, negotiations will be held with the South African Treasury and other financial institutions, which will be required to provide financial guarantees to support all contractual structures and other ancillary contracts. Furthermore, a third of the current Eskom debt, or maybe more, will be moved to the South African government. And as an unbundled Eskom, under the Public-Private Partnership Agreement, the taxpayers will still be required to bail out the PPP in future as part of the financial guarantees negotiated with the government. Only one obstacle stands in the way of these swindlers. And that is you. Yes, you. You must first agree to all of this. These criminals cannot proceed without your tacit approval. And trust me, you do not want to give your consent. Because not only will your beloved Eskom be gone, but an unimaginable future awaits you.